Kamala Harris just lost a presidential election. That means she becomes the 40th entry into my list of almost presidents. This is a list of all the people who finished second place in a presidential election while not being a sitting president or having already been president. She is the 40th person on this list, and so if we're going to look at what Kamala Harris is going to do now in the future, let's look at what these 39 other individuals did after losing presidential elections. Now, Kamala Harris does not have as much time as some of these people did. Kamala Harris is older than average, being 60 at the time of her losing the election, as opposed to the average age of 55. Of the other 39 people on this list, 12 did not again run or serve in any government capacity to any significant extent. There are some interesting stories in that group. For one, Horace Greeley, the loser of the 1872 election, actually died 1 month after losing the presidential election and before the Electoral College could even vote, which led to a really weird Electoral College result in 1872. On the flip side, Alf Landon lived 51 years after losing the 1936 election, finally dying at the age of 100. He never ran for office again, though he did remain involved in foreign policy. Bob Dole, the loser of the 1996 election, used his celebrity from the presidential election to get on TV and to help sell his books. Hillary Clinton, the most recent entrant to this list other than Kamala Harris, has not returned to government, but has also been writing books. The other 27 did stay involved in politics and government. 5 served as governors. The loser of the 1812 election, DeWitt Clinton, was lieutenant governor and mayor of New York at the time of the presidential election, and went on to win 4 governor elections for New York before dying in 1828. John Fremont, the loser of the 1856 election, was a frontiersman in his youth and got to be governor of the Arizona Territory after the Civil War. None of these people went on to serve in the House of Representatives, but 10 served in the United States Senate. The loser of the 1848 presidential election, Lewis Cass, served 8 years in the United States Senate, even becoming president pro tempore of the Senate for 1 day. Stephen Douglas, the second-place finisher in the crazy 1860 election, died 7 months after the election as a sitting member of the United States Senate. Barry Goldwater, the loser of the 1964 election, won 3 more terms in the U.S. Senate from Arizona and remained an active, honest critic of his party until his death in 1998. John McCain, the loser of the 2008 election, returned to the United States Senate and casted the deciding vote against the Obamacare repeal while dying of brain cancer. Many of these people remained involved in foreign affairs, by my count at least 12 if not more. Winfield Scott, the loser of the 1852 election, is mentioned in the oversimplified video Pig War, where he goes and resolves a dispute with Great Britain. He eventually got dismissed from the army for being too fat. John Kerry, the loser of the 2004 election, became a notable Secretary of State under President Barack Obama and held a foreign policy role under President Biden as well. Speaking of, 5 of these individuals went on to hold the office of Secretary of State after losing the presidential election. This includes Lewis Cass, the loser of the 1848 election, who became Secretary of State under James Buchanan; James Blaine, the loser of the 1884 election, who served as Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison; William Jennings Bryan, the loser of the 1896 election, among others, I promise we'll get to it, served as Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson; the loser of the 1916 election, Charles Evans Hughes, who went on to become Secretary of State under both Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, and then later would become the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, quite an impressive individual, and of course, most recently, John Kerry, who was Secretary of State for President Obama. 3 of the people on this list might offer some additional insight into what Kamala Harris will do, because they were also sitting vice presidents at the time when they lost presidential elections. Most recently, Al Gore, who was Bill Clinton's vice president, lost the 2000 election. He did not return to government, though he did become a very famous advocate for climate change action. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president for Lyndon B. Johnson, lost the 1968 election and went on to return to the United States Senate for 7 years before losing a battle with blood cancer. And Richard Nixon, the vice president for Dwight Eisenhower, lost the 1960 election, but would go on to win the 1968 and 1972 presidential elections before resigning from the office in disgrace in 1974. Richard Nixon was not the only person to try again and run for president again. 9 of these people were their party nominees for president after losing the presidential election previously. Let's start with the losers. Charles Pinckney, the loser of the 1804 election, went on to lose again in 1808 and decided to retire from politics to a life of farming. Henry Clay, who had already finished 4th place in the election in 1824, lost as the National Republican Party nominee in 1832, and then helped found the Whig Party, whose nominee he was in 1844 when he lost yet again. He was, however, a leading voice in politics throughout much of the early 19th century. Similarly, William Jennings Bryan, who's the youngest person to make it onto our list, was the Democratic nominee in 1896, 1900, and 1908, losing all 3 times, before deciding to focus on a career in the newspaper business and in foreign affairs, as we discussed, and law practice as well, famously being a lawyer in the Scopes monkey trial. After losing the 1944 election, Thomas Dewey ran again in 1948 and lost, even though some newspapers said he won. Shortly thereafter, the loser of the 1952 election, Adlai Stevenson, decided to run again in 1956 and lost before turning to a career in foreign affairs and advising. 4 individuals did go on to win presidential elections and become president. Thomas Jefferson, after losing the 1796 presidential election, won a rematch against John Adams in 1800 and served 2 full terms. Andrew Jackson, who lost in the crazy 1824 election, won in 1828 in a rematch against John Quincy Adams and was reelected in 1832. William Henry Harrison beat Martin Van Buren in a rematch in 1840, becoming the first Whig president, and died 1 month into his term. And over 100 years would pass before the next and most recent successful return to a presidential election, which was Nixon in 1968. So, what's next for Kamala Harris? Well, she's probably getting close to too old for another successful presidential bid like Nixon did. Nixon was 47 when he lost in 1960, whereas Kamala Harris was 60 when she lost in 2024. However, she's not as old as Hillary Clinton was, who was 69 when she lost in 2016, so she doesn't just have to retire and kind of disappear. I would say it's likely that Kamala Harris stays involved in some way. She might get involved in foreign affairs in a future Democratic administration under whoever becomes president. She might go the Hubert Humphrey route and return to the Senate. She was in the Senate before, so this seems likely. She has returned to California. She has even been rumored as a California gubernatorial candidate for 2026. So I would assume she will stay involved in politics, and those are probably her 3 most likely routes. Either some sort of foreign affairs position, going back to California and running for Senate, or going back to California and running for governor. So, comment below what you think Kamala Harris will do after losing the 2024 presidential election, and thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing.